Welcome. Cass Sunstein is Robert Walmsley University professor at Harvard University. He succeeds Frank Michelman, also participating in the conference, in that eminent position. Now, it's well been said that Cass is a veritable one-man think tank. He's written articles and books on an incredibly rich range of subjects. His range of knowledge and ideas is staggering and inspiring. In all of his work, he displays characteristic virtues of ambition coupled with humility, commitment to justice alongside consideration of prudence and pragmatism, and recognition of problems coupled with an unfailingly constructive approach to alleviating or resolving them. Now, in his work in constitutional theory, he has put forward a highly influential theory of judicial minimalism, and he has said that his theory is appropriate for a political community that could be called Smallville, as opposed to theories like Ronald Dworkin's, which would be appropriate on Mount Olympus. Still, to invoke another classical allusion, there is no doubt that Cass is in the pantheon of constitutional theory. Now, from 2009 to 2012, Cass experienced America's political dysfunction firsthand as administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs in the Obama administration. And he's recently published a book, Simpler, The Future of Government, with some analysis and prescriptions for improving our dysfunctional state of affairs. Cass, we're delighted and honored to have you as keynote speaker today.
Thanks for that incredibly kind introduction. I've known Jim for a long time, and it's great to see you. Thanks for that generosity. Also, it's wonderful to be here. Timely topic, good choice of topic. There's a terrific book called Switch, How to Make Change When Change is Hard. And one of the theories of the book is if things aren't going well in a community or in a nation or a corporation or a government, it's often helpful to look at bright spots, areas where things are going well, and to see if we can generalize from that lesson. And I'm going to try to do that here a little bit by reference to my own experience where I guess I observed dysfunction, certainly in my extended and somewhat torturous confirmation process. So I'll tell you a little story about the confirmation process. I think it has implications for hope. The senator who was hardest for me was Senator Saxby Chambliss, who had a hold on my nomination, wouldn't allow a vote, and his staff thought I was focused only on one thing, and that is animals, which wasn't so good from the standpoint of the agricultural community, and they were very worried, and I can completely understand that. I had a one-hour meeting with Senator Chambliss where he was the soul of courtesy. He's just a good guy. But it was a tough meeting. He asked hard questions, and he was not comfortable, clearly, with much of my writing, at least on non-human creatures. He became Senator Chambliss. He voted against me. He lifted the hold, voted against me, and I don't think he was in voting against me on the cusp of voting for me. But he became just about my favorite senator. He's a good friend, and we worked together, and it was and is terrific. It'll be a loss for the Senate. In terms of switch and functional government, the office that I was privileged to head, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, is a pragmatic, on-the-ground office, not a theoretical office. And so I'm going to be talking about pragmatic, on-the-ground functionality. But I'd like to isolate three general themes which have at least academic heritage. The first, with respect to the operation of regulatory policy within the executive branch, is a theme from Justice Frankfurter, who said in a sentence that I, at least as a law student, thought was preposterous. He said something like the history of Anglo-American freedom is in large part a history of procedural safeguards. As a law student, that seems a dismal thought. Surely, for the history of freedom can't be a history of procedural safeguards, but there's truth and wisdom in it. And one thing within the executive branch that the regulatory apparatus tries to ensure is something like regulatory due process. It doesn't have a clear constitutional foundation because of the bimetallic case, which some of you may be aware of, which says there's no due process requirement in rulemaking. But there is a due process practice in rulemaking, which involves ensuring that people inside and outside the government are genuinely heard. And that is functionality in bold letters. The second idea with a kind of academic pedigree is from John Stuart Mill, and I'm thinking in particular of his great essay on Jeremy Bentham, where Mill, a self-declared utilitarian, focused on the consequences of action as the measure of goodness or badness. A utilitarian, yes, not a consequentialist in the more capacious form understood today. Mill nonetheless criticized Bentham for being like a one-eyed man who could see better with that eye than others because he only had one, was trained well, but he couldn't see depth. So qualitative differences among diverse goods, according to Mill, Bentham was oblivious to. The love of honor, the love of friends, all this is aligned along a single metric, which Bentham's utilitarian calculus used in a way that overrode qualitative differences. So this is a philosophical idea, a critique of one conception of utilitarianism, but in terms of the trenches, it actually matters. President Obama's Executive Order 13563, which is a mini constitution for the regulatory state, its importance cannot be overstated, incidentally, in terms of actual practice, and I'll say a bit about this. The executive order makes an unprecedented commitment to cost-benefit analysis of a Benthamite kind. But at the same time, it emphasizes the legitimacy, this is the president's executive order, the legitimacy of considering qualitative factors that cannot be turned into monetary equivalents, including, and this is the most important of the list, I think, certainly the most original, human dignity. So human dignity is particularly called out in the executive order, and it's playing a significant role in regulations that involve discrimination on the basis of disability, sexual orientation, privacy, and much more. So that second theme is the Millian theme. The third theme, I think we want to associate with some maybe unlikely merger of Amartya Sen and Friedrich Hayek. And I'm going to try to make the unlikely merger not seem ridiculous. Hayek's great contribution to social theory, I think, is a short essay in the American Economic Review called The Uses of Knowledge in Society, where Hayek urged that the price system is better than any planner just because it has more knowledge. This was not a claim about, ill-motivated planners or self-interested planners. It was a claim about what Hayekians now refer to as the knowledge problem. That if you're designing a price for shoes, no matter how smart you are and how diligent, you just won't know as much as the market will know. That was Hayek's claim. And we needed to have some mechanism for aggregating knowledge that's dispersed in society. Now, Sen's emphasis in the last 10 years, insofar as been speaking of government, is about government by discussion. That's a phrase Sen's used repeatedly. And there is an alliance between Hayek's emphasis on the collection of dispersed knowledge and Sen's emphasis on government by discussion. It's both about aggregating information. And one of the things that makes the executive branch regulatory process work well is that information aggregation is possibly its central goal. That the public will often have information that the government lacks, And the process is designed in large part to elicit that information and bring it to bear on rules that involve education or environmental protection or immigration or homeland security. And often there will be dispersed information within the executive branch itself that the rulemaking agency will lack but needs. So you might have the Environmental Protection Agency issuing a rule that affects highways, and the Department of Transportation will know a lot about that. Or you might have a rule from the EPA that will affect the energy supply, and the Department of Energy will know a lot about that. And it's crucially important for the rulemaking entity to get that dispersed information. I don't know if we should consider this at its core an Amartya Sen type theme about government by discussion, or a more kind of nakedly Hayekian theme about the collection of dispersed information. It may be, if we had to opt for one, the Hayekian one is prior, but both play a role. Okay, that's my vaguely theoretical introduction. Now we'll get to trenches. That's me, as a lot of you know, before I started in government. That's me 5 years ago. The idea in that scene, which is from the movie Moneyball, is that just as Washington urged Jefferson that the Senate can cool heat by the more deliberative process it has, so evidence can have a cooling function. At least I'm going to emphasize that, by way of preference to intuitions. And in this scene, Brad Pitt, playing Billy Beane, is arguing for evidence-based rather than intuition-based policy making in the domain of baseball. And in the scene at hand, the scouts are saying that some prospect is an athlete. There's a lot of upside. Billy says he can't hit. The scout says he's not that bad a hitter. Paul, the statistics-obsessed assistant to Billy Beane, reads the stats and says he's not getting a lot of extra base hits and walks. And so Billy says, my only question is, if he is such a good hitter, why doesn't he hit better? The scouts are saying over and over again that the guy has a great body. He has the best body in the draft. And Billy responds, we're not selling jeans here, and throws the people who would be good in a jean commercial onto his bad list, shit list. Okay. One question is whether progress of the Moneyball kind might be possible amidst dysfunction. And I'll tell you a little thing I did that was small. The OIRA staff consists of technocrats. They're civil servants. I have no idea what their political allegiance is. They're trying to figure out something about the policy sense of various initiatives in a way that is politically not easily classifiable. Basically, is this going to fulfill its intended purpose? Have public comments been considered? Occasionally they would tell me, my staff, you should know an interest group is very exercised about this, or you should know a member of Congress is going to make a fuss if this goes one way or another. And they would do it not thinking that should be the driver of policy by any means, but thinking that that was important to realize. And my response to that was, that's sewer talk, get your mind out of the gutter, which I said with a smile, not as a reprimand, and it became an internal joke, but it was a norm-constructing joke which turned, to some degree, the focus, I say to some degree because the focus was never on the staff's part political, but it turned them to the regulatory Moneyball, and away from even giving a nod in the direction of political considerations, unless the relevant interest group or the concerned member of Congress could have information that it was important to bring to bear. And if this seems a little bit too optimistic to think that the technocratic can have a cooling function, I'll just tell you a story. I'll abstract from the facts. But there was a regulation that was proposed a few years ago that was extremely controversial, especially among the Republican House members. And you can identify the names probably offhand of the people who would be most unhappy. And as the regulation came out, and it did come out, it took on board several of the concerns expressed by those who were objecting in a way that was highly technical, that the concerns had a particularity and a fine grain quality that got both low-level civil servant and high-level political attention. And the rule came out, it was a very expensive rule, it didn't back off from its fundamental goals, but it came out in a way that responded to 5 of the strongest concerns. And I think this was the only time I did this. I called the most exercised member of the House of Representatives personally and said, the rule's coming out today, here are the details. I went through everything. And his response was, boy, that sounds good. I'm going to issue a supportive press statement. He never issued the statement. I'm sure his staff said, you can't do that. But he didn't issue a negative statement. And it wasn't because he particularly liked me. It was because the technical material was convincing to him. And he was on top of the technical. Okay, we're not selling jeans here. Here's something that I fear looks a little like propaganda, but I can tell you that this has been through peer review and technical review and was compiled by the technocrats without any political oversight, except to check to make the numbers were right, but not to compromise the basic message. The idea is that in the Bush administration, through 3 fiscal years, the total net benefits of regulations were over $3 billion. That's an achievement, not to be disparaged. In the Obama administration, through 3 fiscal years, it's over $90 billion, over 26 times the number. I'm going to say a little bit of the Millian kind about the meaning of these numbers. But let's just notice that the number of rules issued in the first 3 and 4 years of the Obama administration smaller than the number issued in the Bush administration, attesting to concerns about the risk of overregulation and regulatory uncertainty in an economically difficult time. But notice also the focus on regulatory moneyball has a palpable payoff. By the way, I'm kind of lowballing these numbers because after I left, a draft report came out from the Office of Management and Budget, also done by technical people, that carries through the 4 fiscal years, all of them, not just the first 3, and the total number is $150 billion. So a terrific year was the last one, produced in part by a fuel economy rule for cars, which is really ratcheting up fuel economy by 2025. You may have heard of that. And also a mercury rule from the EPA, which is saving thousands of lives annually. Those are ratcheting up the net benefits. I'm not including it because that report is now undergoing peer review and public comment, and it might be the numbers will change. These have gone through that process. Okay, what concretely does this mean? That's the Millian question, not the million, M-I-L-L-I-A-N. In terms of consumer savings, some of you in this room probably have cars that are getting a lot better fuel economy than they otherwise would because of the first ratcheting up of fuel economy standards in the United States since the mid-'80s. And billions of dollars in savings for American consumers are flowing from fuel economy rules. There's a series of energy efficiency rules involving refrigerators, small motors, clothes dryers, clothes washers, which haven't gotten a ton of publicity, but which means the market for appliances looks a lot different in the United States in a way that's going to cost consumers something in the short run. They're a little more expensive to buy up front, but over the life of the product, the benefits are dwarfing the costs for consumers. That's billions of dollars in savings. The third category I'll just mention, which is that there's a strong deregulatory program by the Obama administration, which is eliminating billions of dollars in costs for businesses large and small, and those are connected with an increased potential for economic growth because regulatory overreach is being cut into a little bit every day, and the $91 billion reflects a deregulatory and streamlining program. One little item from which some of you may be benefiting even now is the recent announcement that you can use your Kindles or iPads on the airplanes as they're taking off and landing. That's connected with the ongoing scrutiny of regulatory requirements. Some of these, as I'll mention in a bit, have much more significant economic consequences. If you've noticed the TSA pre-sign in airports also, and the Global Entry Program, which allows people to enter quickly when they've left the United States through a kiosk rather than a long line, that's also associated with the deregulatory and streamlining program. Okay, the benefits include also thousands of lives saved and tens of thousands of injuries and accidents avoided as a result of regulatory requirements. And these things don't get a lot of publicity typically. In 2011, the number of deaths on the highway was the lowest in recorded history. That's, I think, a stunning fact because we're not talking about the rate, but the actual number. You might expect the rate to go down. You wouldn't expect the number to go down given there are more people driving and the potential for accidents is higher with population increase. But the number's gone down. And that's a tribute not only to the creativity of the private sector, but also to regulatory requirements that, for example, make trucks have quicker stopping distance. They don't run into people. That's saving hundreds of lives per year. And rules that make it so that if vehicles are in accidents, the likelihood that people will escape without serious harm is increased. And we did a bunch of those. The EPA has taken on the chin in the last few years for regulatory costs. It's important to see that the air is a lot cleaner in the United States than it would otherwise be. And the mercury rule, which I mentioned, is saving thousands of lives every year. There are people, a lot of them older, some of them not so old, who are healthy or alive today as a result of cleaner air. Okay, here are some nonpartisan concepts for you. And I think I'm going to emphasize just a subset of them because, well, the first is pretty much self-explanatory. There's a statute, the credit card statute, enacted in 2009 in the aftermath of the financial crisis, which you may not have heard of. It has a lot of nudges in it, in the form of disclosure requirements and default rules. You may have seen on your credit card bill disclosures of multiple kinds, about if there's an interest rate increase, you have to be told about it and told you can cancel, and also information about late fees and overuse fees and your interest payments, what they're going to be like if you don't pay them off. It's a nudge-pervaded statute which has some mandates and bans, but not a lot. It's mostly preserving freedom and choice. A recent study suggests that the Credit Card Act, it's by economists with a lot of numbers, is saving American consumers over $20 billion every year in terms of late fees and overuse charges. Now that's big news, $20 billion a year for American consumers. A kind of law review style footnote, meaning a footnote that has the really important stuff, adds that those benefits are disproportionately being enjoyed by people with bad credit ratings. That's terrific news because you might think disclosure requirements and such would have an impact mostly on people who are, you know, careful and not likely to get into financial trouble. The opposite is true. And the people with bad credit ratings are the people who need a little economic help, and that they're getting it. The idea of choice architecture just refers to the fact that all of our choices have an architecture behind them. If people sign a form at the beginning, there's evidence that they're less likely to lie than if they sign it at the end. At the beginning, primes honesty. If a candy bar is green in a green wrapper, people who are health conscious are more likely to buy it. Even if it's as healthy, it's no more healthy than one that's in red. It's all milk chocolate. You're going to get fat. The green wrapper is helpful. If a cafeteria is designed in such a way that foods are at the beginning rather than at the end, those foods are more likely to be purchased. Small changes in the construction of choice situations often have a very significant impact on outcomes. And this is something that I think Mill missed in his great essay on liberty. He missed the extent to which choice architecture is inevitable. It's infecting people's decisions even when there isn't harm to others. And a government is inevitably, therefore, affecting decisions in the harm to self case, even if it isn't self-consciously trying to do so. We know from a lot of work in behavioral economics that human beings are more error-prone than standard economics thought. And one thing that's particularly important to keep in mind, certainly it was very important for some of the policies of the Obama administration, is people can neglect the long term. Sometimes the long term seems like another country, later land, and it's unclear that we're ever going to visit. Merrill Lynch has taken advantage of this finding by showing people pictures of themselves 10 years, 20 years, 30 years out. I've seen myself at the age of 100, and maybe because the computer program's kind, it's not so terrible. Otherwise, maybe you just not look anymore and get sad. But if you see yourself aged, then you're more likely to save, because your future self becomes someone real rather than an abstraction. And that's important because neurologically we know that for a significant percentage of the population, people's future selves are just strangers. When they think of themselves a year from now, they don't think of themselves the way they think of themselves tomorrow. There's a part of the brain that identifies this. And those people who see their a year from now selves as strangers, which is probably a significant number of people in this room, is just true in a large population, those people are unlikely to defer gratification. They'll do something that'll get their future selves in trouble. We also know that there's a propensity toward unrealistic optimism, which is probably good on Darwinian grounds. It creates entrepreneurship and activity, but it can lead people to fail to take precautions. Okay. Nudges versus standard economic tools. If there's any slide of this set that you remember, I hope it's this one, because what I'm going to be opposing is simple nudges which have not been politically controversial or a source of dysfunction, with economic tools which are often more complicated and expensive and which do often run into a political buzzsaw. Okay, Senator Coburn, Republican senator, quite conservative, in the debates over the Affordable Care Act was asking not for an individual mandate but for automatic enrollment, urging that through an automatic enrollment policy you could get much of the benefit of an individual mandate without using coercion at all. He's completely on top of the behavioral economics, and his staff and he knew the underlying research, which comes mostly from the savings area. In Denmark, automatic enrollment in savings plans has a bigger impact on savings than significant tax incentives. Now, as a long-term University of Chicago guy, that's barely believable. The reason it's barely believable is under the Coase theorem, automatic enrollment should have essentially no effect so long as transaction costs are low, and they are in Denmark. Also, significant tax incentives should have a huge effect. That's the driver of behavior. Notwithstanding those self-evident truths, automatic enrollment has a much bigger effect than significant tax incentives. Now imagine you're a struggling government thinking you want to help people to have comfortable retirements. One choice, automatic enrollment. Another choice, big money for the people who elect to save. The automatic enrollment one is much more attractive, and it turns out to be more effective. There's a study of the FAFSA program, which is designed to give people who need money financial aid to get to college, which suggests that simplification of FAFSA, which the president referred to just yesterday, I think, in talking about the importance of simplification in the context of healthcare. The work, which we were very alert to, shows that if you simplify the form, you can have the same impact as a several $1,000s increase in the subsidy. Two approaches: simplify the form, give people several $1,000s extra. For a politically divided and economically strapped nation, the increase in the subsidy is not such a feasible idea. Form simplification, everybody likes. There's a company, Opower, you may know of it, which sends people a very simple form, basically notifying them how their energy use compares with that of their neighbors. Maybe you've seen it. It tells you whether you're using a lot of energy compared to your neighbors or not. It turns out that the Opower form, the simple one-pager, which is essentially costless, sometimes it's a little longer, but it's very cheap to send out, has the same impact as an 8 to 20% increase in the price of energy. That's stunning, isn't it? That the social norm nudge has the same impact as a simple increase, as a costly and costly to administer increase in the price of energy. We're getting findings of these three sorts basically every week, showing domains in which the simple nudge is having an effect, in some cases an effect equivalent to or greater than that of the mandate or ban, and that creates a promising, I think, line of progress across partisan lines. Certainly I found in DC that for all the divisions, insofar as the administration was taking approaches of the kind on this slide, Republicans and Democrats were not split. On the contrary, they were both highly receptive. Okay, here's the old USDA food pyramid, which is, shows some person, gender unclear, walking to the top of a pyramid towards some white triangle. Imagine you're a student or a teacher or a parent trying to help promote healthy eating. Is that white triangle thinness? Is it death? Unclear what you're walking toward. The foods are all scrambled together, aren't they, at the bottom? So what is each of those items? Can you tell? It's hard. There's one thing on the bottom right that does seem recognizable, doesn't it? It's a shoe. On the bottom right. Is one supposed to eat a shoe? We replaced this with the new USDA food plate, which is in effect now all over the United States. Is getting international attention. It's a nudge. It's like a GPS. You can ignore it if you want. It's choice preserving, but it says if you make half your plate fruits and vegetables, you're most of the way home. Now, what's noteworthy about this little tale is the idea of plate, not pyramid, can organize decisions in multiple domains. Often resistance to a policy proposal, from a Republican to a Democrat, from a Democrat to a Republican, from an administration to Congress, often the resistance, not always, but often the resistance is a response to ambiguity, not to disagreement. And once the thing becomes clarified, often, certainly not always, the disagreement is narrowed and sometimes it even evaporates. I had a friend in the administration who was involved in a complicated international negotiation who several days before the negotiation was distressed at the apparently doomed nature of this quite important negotiation. And the friend went to the country to try to make some progress. It was something of considerable importance, and a failed negotiation would have been not good. This isn't Syria, by the way. This is not Syria, not that big. And I called my friend the day across international wires, the day of or wireless, I guess, cross international, whatever, air, to ask what had happened. And there was an exclamation in the phone, plate, not pyramid. I said, what do you mean? And the account was everything worked out because the United States offered 12 ideas. They were all concrete. And the other nation said, 8 of those are just fine by us. The fact that things had been blocked was a product of a pyramid world where people didn't know what was sought. And once the ambiguity was resolved, it disintegrated. Here's the old fuel economy label, which some of you may remember. It's not meaningful in the sense that it refers to a metric, miles per gallon, that's hard to map onto anything that people care about. Here's the new one. You may have seen this. A little more complicated than may be ideal, but it reflects two things that people do care about. One is money, and the other is the environment. It gives people a clear sense of economic costs and savings. And for those who care, which is a minority, it gives a sense of environmental importance. The difference between this one and this one is we did a great deal of empirical testing to see what people understood and what they would find helpful in informing their decisions. This one was not tested empirically. It is in the nature of a nudge, but it's a confusing pyramid-like nudge. This is more plate-like in the sense that it puts the eye on things that people actually care about. Simplified disclosure of this form is now pervasive. The idea that this is going to cure what ails us seems overambitious. But notice, if you would, in many contexts, ranging from environmental protection to financial system, disclosure has been found to have a massive effect on outcomes. And so there's real promise there, and this doesn't cause dysfunction at all. Okay, automatic enrollment is simpler. Here's an area where savings policies show big increases in enrollment in plans just by virtue of the fact that people are automatically in the system. We know from very recent studies, this is one of the ever-expanding universe of simple, low-cost initiatives that are having an impact, that if printers are set by default for double-sided printing, paper is saved big time. At a large university in Sweden, that mere shift in the default setting for printing cut paper use by 15%. A 10% tax on paper use is extrapolated to cut paper use by 2%. Education and moral suasion about the importance of conserving paper saves paper use by 0%. Okay. Opt-in versus opt-out. More people stay in under opt-out, even at low transactions costs. So default rules really matter. One rule that I was involved in that didn't cause any dysfunction or any tension among actors within the government is a rule from the Department of Agriculture that stems from a program called direct certification, which says that school children in the United States who are eligible for meals, lunches and breakfasts, automatically get that access without having their parents have to fill out forms. And the reason that's so important is there are a lot of poor families in the United States for whom form filling is confusing or frightening, and they just don't do it. State and local governments know who those families are from other sources, so they can just directly certify them as eligible. One little rule, one small part of the direct certification program is giving over 250,000 American children access to meals to which they're legally entitled, which they otherwise wouldn't get. It's just an artifact of automatic enrollment. The health care bill, in a way that overlaps with Senator Coburn's interest, will by 2015 require large employers automatically to enroll employees into the system. And notice that some of the challenges that healthcare.gov is facing will be reduced. Large employers are automatically enrolling people and they don't have to sign up. I think this is a way forward for the future that can cut across some of the divisions that we're observing in Washington. Okay, complexity, as we're seeing with healthcare.gov, can have unanticipatedly severe adverse effects. A series of actions quietly were done in the last 4 years, quietly in the sense that the newspapers didn't pay any attention to them, to simplify requirements. One of the problems with the prescription drug program that President Bush signed is that it's very hard for people to navigate the system, to figure out what program is best for them. Too many options that are too confusing to sort through. So a simple rule, I think it got no attention, that the Obama administration issued, said if the program is one that no one's choosing, it's probably causing confusion, and it can't be listed anymore. a wisdom of the crowds idea as applied to option provision. If no one's been choosing it over a period, it has to be deleted. Also, if the program that's being included is purely duplicative of another program offered by the same provider, it has to be deleted too. That's not a perfect fix, but it's a big simplifier, and it makes it less likely that people will be distracted and confused. As one of my last acts in government, I directed all agencies, and this is in effect, to take the following step. Before they ask Americans to fill out a form that's complicated, they have to do empirical testing to see how long it takes to fill out the form. Now, this might seem too technical to be a kind of solution to America's ills, but let's just notice that Americans spend more than 9 billion hours annually filling out forms. If you took the entire population of Philadelphia or San Francisco, put them in a place, asked them to spend 7 days a week of the next year, starting January 1, filling out forms 10 hours a day. By the end of that year, neither community will have spent nearly as many hours on form filling as the American public did in that year. And that exerts a big cost on companies and ordinary people. Big effort to cut through that tangle, something again that is eliminating now over 100 million, already in a short time, over 100 million hours in annual paperwork burdens, which is not saving lives, but which is reducing costs. In addition, a small step I took, which is connected both with regulatory democracy and with simplification, is to require every agency that's issuing a large rule that's complicated to have a simple executive summary that precedes the often 500 or 600 page document. This may seem like so intuitive and obvious a step that it wouldn't have any impact, but it's turned out to promote transparency in a way that triggers accountability. People can now see the content of rules at a glance, and that's helped to provide corrections. Okay, we know from a lot of data that social norms operate as nudges, and that, at least in many iterations, they aren't controversial, they don't divide anybody. Two problems that any government, Republican or Democrat, is likely to be concerned about are childhood obesity and distracted driving. And two ways to get at them are through working with the private sector to try to activate emerging social norms. And we've seen significant progress in those domains in the recent past. Okay, you need a choice architecture for choice architects. And here we're getting to democratic theory and some constitutional foundations a bit directly. The largest surprise I received in government, someone asked me before, what did I learn? And I didn't disclose until now, number one on the list. In the world of administrative law and public law generally, the following is the sophisticated view, capital T, capital S, capital V. The sophisticated view is when a rule goes out for public comment, it's already baked, that there's been internal discussion, that there's been discussion with stakeholders, my nominee for the most ugly word in the English language, stakeholders. The discussion with stakeholders, the public comment process is a charade. It's kabuki theater. And that idea is so well entrenched in the world of administrative law that it's actually in the Breyer et al. Administrative law casebook, and I confess I'm one of the alls. That sophisticated view could not be further from the truth. The public comments on rules are essentially important. Time and again, a rule is proposed, it is not baked. All the thought in the world is given to try to make the best broth, but the people inside know, there are open questions, and even when they don't know that, and even when they believe that's not true, the comments come in and reveal that something important has been missed. Frequently, and maybe you've seen this in recent years if you're following, recent months if you're following the headlines, the government will come out with a rule thinking that it's perfectly sound, the comments will reveal otherwise, and the rule will either be abandoned or reproposed because some new information has come in. This is the Hayekian theme big time, and modern technology allows the Hayekian emphasis on collection of dispersed information to be used in domains that scared him, that is government rulemaking. These words on regulations.gov, let your voice be heard, are not happy talk. They are real. The President, by Executive Order 13563, has required the technical and supporting data, the underlying material behind rules to be posted on regulations.gov. Not just that, but the comments are posted on regulations.gov, and the comments on the comments are posted on regulations.gov. The people at very high levels in the White House who are involved in rulemaking, not infrequently, are looking at regulations.gov and seeing what interested people have said about the rules. And these are people in the White House, not just at the rulemaking agencies. And time and again, that alters the content of rules. That's choice architecture for the people who are choice architects. Data.gov is a website that was under considerable economic pressure recently because of what you all know, cost-saving efforts. One of the very few heroes of saving Data.gov, a pride of the Obama administration, is Congressman Issa, who came to the defense of Data.gov and said, this is about transparency, it's great, we need to pay for it. What Data.gov does is to disclose, not just to the American public, but to the world, hundreds of thousands of data sets through a process by which the government is, on an ongoing basis, putting online data that it holds internally. I'll disclose that OIRA was one of the set of entities that had the lead for implementation of the Open Government Initiative. And in our first meeting with the agencies all over government, I was one of the people running the meeting, and I had a lot of trepidation, thinking here are people from all these departments, the State Department, HHS, Transportation, EPA. They have a lot of work to do, and now the White House is telling them they have to do all this stuff. And this is going to be just a tough meeting where we're going to have to cajole them to get the internal apparatus fulfilling the requirements the President has asked them to. What a surprise. The atmosphere in the room was electric. There was no need for cajoling. There was a set of government actors who were committed to transparency and release of data, who just needed a signal from the White House that this was a desirable thing to do. They had more creativity and energy than we could possibly have imagined. And the fact that Data.gov now has data sets, many of which are operating in such a way as to create apps that are on your phone, is a tribute to the functionality of this process. So there's material on clean air, there's material on airport security lines, there's material on child safety seats, there's material on everything under the sun, and some of it actually, well, I guess we don't have anything over the sun, but some of it approaching the sun, some stuff from NASA that is potentially of the same magnitude of the GPS, which President Clinton actually released as part of a precursor to Data.gov. In the fullness of time, this website is going to deliver a lot of economic and non-economic benefits because people have some information with which they can make better decisions. Okay, the regulatory look back. I mentioned deregulation as an Obama administration priority. The President signaled it repeatedly. And the idea was that human beings are being adversely affected by regulatory requirements that have not been rethought and that need to be. Now, the idea of regulatory relief on business doesn't get everyone's juices flowing. So let's just give an example that doesn't quite have that form. There were restrictions from HHS for a significant time on telemedicine, growing out of the statutes it administers designed to promote patient safety. The idea is a doctor can't, through the telephone or the internet, be a doctor. But if you're in a remote rural area and you need access to medical care, the only specialists may be people who are at another place. And as part of this initiative, HHS allowed telemedicine. That's saving millions of dollars in economic costs, but it's also producing significant health benefits that we couldn't monetize coming from medical care people are now getting. As a result of the regulatory look back, in a short time, billions of dollars in regulatory costs have been eliminated. There are over 580 initiatives identified in the first set. A very small fraction of them are saving costs big time for individuals and for businesses alike. There's a lot in the healthcare domain that has a regulatory feature. That's no news. What you may not know is the Department of Health and Human Services has also eliminated a large set of regulatory impositions on doctors and hospitals and nurses. I personally read most of the comments on regulations.gov, and the degree of enthusiasm and relief that came from the medical community from this initiative cannot possibly be overstated. I hope you don't remember the most Twittered moment of a recent State of the Union address in which the president made some reference to not crying over spilled milk. I hope you don't remember that. So I'm kind of responsible for that. In the sense that, not in the sense that it had anything to do with speech, but in the sense that there was a regulation imposing on milk producers the same requirements imposed on oil producers, which put the agricultural community that transports milk under severe regulatory scrutiny because they had to act like they were transporting oil. That doesn't make a lot of sense. That regulation was eliminated, saving over $145 million annually, hence the not unbelievably funny line. Okay, one way to think about the look back is that the consequence of regulatory moneyball in the good Millian fashion is to focus on the human consequences of regulatory initiatives. And that was something that did provide a bright spot in the government. The focus on what are the actual consequences, rather than on what will the newspapers say, what do the interest groups think, is this a partisan matter, consistently had the effect of dampening things down and calming things. I can say in that general universe, there were often discussions inside the executive branch where there was great disagreement. And two lines were often a salvation for the participants in the disagreement. One was, okay, we've admired the problem. Now what are we going to do about it? And the other was, if someone said quietly, this is knowable. The reference to something being knowable would simultaneously dampen dissent and get people to find something out. That often worked out in relaxing partisan pressure. I'm going to say something to you about the future, but want to say something more abstract before I get to that, which is that there's been a quiet period for which, you know, set of institutions deserves the credit that has been anything but dysfunctional within the last years, and that's the regulatory apparatus of the executive branch. The numbers tell the tale. They don't tell the whole tale because they can't capture the Millian features. And Republicans and Democrats don't sharply disagree about that, even if they have disagreements about the appropriate volume of regulatory action. Okay, 6 future directions. iPads and tablets and such are usable by little kids, even if they are undergirded by incredibly complex machinery. That needs to be a model for government. The interaction between the citizen and the state needs to be more like the interaction between a human being and a tablet. There are domains in which we're getting there, and that needs to be ramped up. There has to be greater empirical assessment of the human consequences of what the government does, both at the congressional level and within the executive branch. With respect to some, I won't bore you with the details, but with respect to some scientific questions, the jury is still out and it needs to be brought in. The retrospective analysis of rules, which can lead to streamlining and elimination, but also expansion of programs that are working and saving lives, that needs to be regularized in the federal government. There's a good argument that President Obama's greatest contribution to the regulatory structure is the institutionalization of retrospective analysis of rules, an achievement comparable to Reagan's initial prospective analysis. That needs to be taken seriously by all actors in government. One problem that no administration has come to terms with and has significant consequences for our economy is the problem of cumulative burdens. So each individual faces a bandwidth problem, as discussed in the great new book Scarcity by Sendhil Mullainathan and Eldar Shafir. It's a bandwidth problem each of us faces, and in the sense that we have limited time and attention. And it's often easy to neglect the bandwidth problem, certainly when one is thinking of other people and sometimes of oneself. You may have from government a regulatory requirement makes a great deal of sense in isolation, and then another one does, and another one does, and yet another one does. And then there are 4 imposed on the same actor, and cumulatively they're wreaking havoc. This was the problem I heard maybe more from small business about than any other, and there needs to be some mechanism to handle it. I can tell you a little bit if you want about initiatives, but they're at their initial stages. The gold standard for regulatory Moneyball is not ex-ante cost-benefit analysis, but it's randomized controlled trials. That's an idea that shouldn't split people along political lines. It's standard in medicine. It's not standard in policy making. It ought to be. The great initiative in this domain comes from the United Kingdom and not from the United States, where Prime Minister Cameron, a conservative, has pioneered the creation of a behavioral insights team, sometimes called the Nudge Unit, which is doing randomized trials time and again to see what are the consequences of various approaches. And they keep learning. The Prime Minister has largely succeeded in cooling what could have been a political contest over the Nudge Unit because it's empirical. And once you see the evidence, this saves money, this costs money, this helps the environment, this doesn't, this gets people jobs, this doesn't, then what are people going to fight about? Maybe just the data. The Obama administration recently created a behavioral insights team analogous to the UK variety, and this ought to be something we see early in the 21st century being elevated. In general, and this is my basic pitch, empirical assessment has the potential to be a great cooler of dysfunction. My greatest challenge in my confirmation process was to calm Republican senators, particularly Senator Chambliss. And maybe it's a hopeful sign that probably my best friend in the United States Senate is Senator Saxby Chambliss. Thanks.
You can just
Can you stand up?
passing a microphone.
Don't bring your microphone.
I want to say several things. One is, this changed my whole sense of what was going on at these meetings because it's the first thing I've heard that made me feel optimistic. I've always told people that I'm an optimist. I think the future is uncertain. Now at least there was something that looked like it could be done, whereas many of the general themes that were in the other talks, which were fascinating, I learned a lot, were unclear in terms of how they are implemented. And the idea that you had of things being automatically implemented, and I thought of an example right here that I learned about all these things you talked about automatically because I was sitting here and had no place else to go. If you had sent me a paper with all this written, I could have left it on my desk with lots of other papers. And so this shows how powerful it is. But let me raise two quick questions. One is, how does what you're talking about fit into what has been described in various ways as some of the dysfunctions in the American political system? I think about the idea of having things happen automatically to people without their sort of knowing it or agreeing to it as being attacked as taking away their freedom by the government because they're doing things to them they don't even know about. So that there is a political world in which it lives that may interfere with some of the things you can't sneak by them as you did in your office. The other thing, this is a very general point that Kay Schlossman and I have been working, and Henry Brady have been working on for a long time, which is the nature of political voice. Who is it who sends messages to the government? And the idea of the number of messages coming in with people's comments on it doesn't take into account that messages that come in from the public are highly stratified, that they will come from a particular part of the population, and many won't think of doing that. I don't know whether that can be dealt with. But basically, I thought this was wonderful.
Thank you. You're my teacher, so I'm especially grateful for kind words. They're both fabulous questions. So in terms of the comments that come in, you're quite right that you have to have a degree of expertise and literacy to make comments. And there's a skewing in the sense that the people who know Washington and know rulemaking are more likely to make comments. Now, does that result in any other kind of skewing that should be alarming? That's a legitimate question, and probably the answer would depend on context. If there's a rule involving workplace safety, you're going to hear a lot from the people who are, you would think, inclined to object, and also a lot from the people who are inclined to support, because the workplace safety advocates are expert, and there are a lot of them, and they know how to deal with government. So it's a good question whether there's an epistemic tilt and of what kind exactly it is. One thing I would emphasize, as important as the comments are, there's a great deal of reality checking within government, which has its own experts and civil servants. So the Department of Labor knows a lot about workplace safety. OSHA has a lot of civil servants. And the Council of Economic Advisors knows a lot about the economics of these issues, and they'll all be talking to each other. And if someone comes in and says, this rule you say is going to cost $100 million, it's actually $2 billion, that won't be taken by any means at face value. And if the labor advocates say, you say it's $100 million, it's actually going to be $2 million. That's not going to be taken. So there's internal expertise which operates as a check. The automatic enrollment and such, your first question, I hope nothing was snuck by, because transparency for all of these things is completely crucial. Whether it gets a lot of attention is another question, but the automatic enrollment for savings, that was spoken about more than one occasion by the President of the United States. So that was hardly covert. And the direct certification for the kids, that was very open and public. It was an initiative from the Department of Agriculture that was part of formal rulemaking. For those who are concerned about automatic enrollment being a form of paternalism or choice deprivation, notice that there's going to be a choice architecture in the situation anyhow. So either people are automatically enrolled or not, and there's nothing in the state of nature or the structure of the universe that says that 100% of your take-home pay goes to savings, and it goes to wages and 0 to savings. So there's going to be some automatic something anyhow. And the question maybe is what's the right default rather than whether to have a default.
Oh, thank you. So I think that a lot of the issues that we think about connected to dysfunction the problem is that people disagree about the goals, right? So here, there are really debates in a way about the means of doing things and how to make them less or more onerous. But in other cases, people are disagreeing because they don't agree about whether government should be doing something at all. So on the school lunches, for example, it may be more efficient if they're automatically enrolled, but if you don't think government should do that, you're not going to support it. The EPA has certainly been criticized very severely because it seems to impose costs on businesses, and various people don't want that interference at all, or they don't think there's any reason to be concerned about the environment. The healthcare law, the disagreements about contraceptive care being offered automatically to women, deeply controversial. So it seems like maybe a lot of the dysfunctionality has to do with goals and what the government should be doing rather than how it might do it if it were doing it.
That's great and undoubtedly true. The question is whether some debates, which seem like they're debates about goals or values, are actually debates about facts and means. So a speculation is we often think that value divisions are the driver, but at least often, certainly not always, and you've given some examples of why not always is important, it's actually a factual disagreement that's the driver. So for air pollution rules, if you really thought a rule would cost $200 million and save 1,000 lives a year, on what account could you object to that rule? You'd have to be valuing a human life at a really small amount. And the environmental regulations that were contentious in Washington, the contestation was basically about the factual judgment that underpinned the EPA's decision to go forward. Or there were people who had, very abstract, highfalutin something, which on reflection they themselves probably would not be committed to. Like, if you think air pollution regulation is bad, people don't believe that. They believe that we are imposing high costs for insufficient gain. There were some on the left who were, they never saw an environmental regulation they didn't like. But on reflection, if you have an environmental regulation that where the fact is the health and environmental savings are modest, but the cost is $20 billion, on what theory would you support that? And as the discussions emerged, the environmentalists would not urge, we have a goal. They'd say, you think the cost is this, it's going to be a third of this. And then you have something you can talk about. And the Republicans in the House would not say, on reflection, they wouldn't say this rule is bad because it's a safety rule. They say it's going to cost 5 times as much as you think, and we don't believe the benefits. Then you have something to talk about. And so what I wonder is whether the technocratic path forward doesn't have much more promise than the rhetoric of political debate suggests. Now, there's also electoral self-interest on the part of Congress, and that complicates what I just said. So there are some members of Congress who would say, that's plenty reasonable, but I have to make a public statement against it because I don't want to lose. And I'm sure there are complete democratic equivalents, which is why the bright spot really is this is a pro-technocracy, pro-executive branch theme, insofar as the two are wedded with the Hayekian, Frankfurterian, and Millian strands.
I can't help asking what you think of Dan Kahan's work. Do you think it's influenced by the peculiarities of the debate over guns, Or do you think there's something more to the argument that in many, many public policy disputes, the facts at some level just don't matter?
I don't know how many of you know Kahan's work on cultural cognition. I think it's extremely interesting, and it's clearly capturing something. There are areas in which it is true that people's self-identification is such that they're just not going to be receptive to claims of a certain kind, especially if they come from certain someones. So if you think, you just think guns don't kill people, people kill people, and gun control is foolish and intrusive and a Second Amendment violation, it's going to be very hard to convince someone like that that they're wrong, because it's so I think that's truth in it. I do think it's probably important, and this is maybe a tribute to our constitutional order, to distinguish among people of the sort Kahan is surveying, who have, intense self-identifications. Distinguish them from our elected representatives. And, Madison Federalist 10, I think if he read Kahan's work, he wouldn't be stunned or in disagreement, but he'd say our constitutional order creates safeguards against those forms of polarization. And this conference is about, in part, whether the Madisonian optimism is warranted, and there are questions to be asked. But just a fact, there's a lot of debate about whether climate change is real and whether we should put a price on it. The Obama administration has put a price on it. It's about $36 a ton through a technical document, named a technical document, and it's driving policy time and again. It's a social cost of carbon document, and it's full of numbers and technical stuff. Now, the criticisms that have been made of it from people who don't like it are partly technical criticisms and partly criticisms about transparency. Those are what they are. And that's beautiful, I think, because they aren't questions, my self-understanding is such that I can't believe climate change is real. It's this didn't get enough public scrutiny and the numbers aren't right. There's a way forward. On the numbers, it's knowable. On transparency, and the Obama administration recently announced it's going to create a public process for scrutinizing that technical document.
One last question, the gentleman in the back.
To what extent is the administrative state involved with dysfunction? Does the administrative state contribute to dysfunction? Does it lessen dysfunction? And I ask this because there are a lot of voices out there that say that the problem with dysfunction is that government is too big.
I think we need to specify dysfunction. So the idea that there are domains where government should recede, that's clearly correct. And the Obama retrospective review program is designed to eliminate government presence where it's not justified. And we found 580 candidate areas in a quick review, probably a lot more. So that's clearly right. I'm not sure what's meant by dysfunction. I mean, one understanding, and I know the conference is about that, one way into it is to think, what are the human consequences of our government? What's it actually doing? And the administrative state under Republican and Democratic rule isn't looking so bad because the human consequences are on net, according to the best measures we have, positive. So there are countless areas for reform. There are areas where we need more regulation. There are plenty of areas where we need less. We need empirical testing rather than cultural divisions and value debates. Not something like this 6, but I think that such dysfunction as we observe is not principally a product of the administrative state, though the administrative state needs to get much, much, much smarter in the next decade.